The first thing everyone noticed about Marcus Doyle was the jacket. It had once been navy blue, though 3 winters of wear had faded it to something closer to gray. And the left cuff had been mended so many times that the stitching had become its own small pattern. A quiet map of a man who fixed things himself rather than replaced them. He wore it into the glass-walled conference room on the 14th floor of Halberd Consulting Group on a Tuesday morning in March, carrying a stack of printouts under one arm, and he did not notice at first the way 3 pairs of eyes moved from his face down to his shoes and back up again with the particular cruelty of people who believe amusement costs nothing. "Is that a Halloween costume?" Jordan Weiss asked, not quite under his breath, loud enough that the sound carried across the polished table to where Priya Anand sat with her tablet and to where Court Ferris, the newest hire in the analytics group, was still deciding whether laughing along was the safer choice. "And hey, welcome back. Before we start, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments." Marcus set his printouts down at the far end of the table. He did not look up right away. When he did, his expression held nothing that could be called anger, only the calm, unhurried patience of a man who had absorbed 1,000 small comments before this one and had learned somewhere along the way that the ones who needed to laugh the loudest were rarely the ones who felt the most secure. "Good morning," he said, and began arranging his notes. Nobody in that room could have known that by the end of the day. 2 of the people laughing would be carrying cardboard boxes to the elevator, their key cards already deactivated, their names already stripped from the internal directory. Nobody could have known that the man in the mended jacket had, 6 hours earlier, signed a document that would rewrite the entire org chart of Halberd Consulting Group. Nobody could have known, because Marcus Doyle had spent 3 weeks making absolutely certain that no one would. What they knew was only this. A single father in a thrift store blazer had joined the strategy division 7 weeks ago, said very little, worked very hard, and apparently did not own a decent suit. They would learn the rest soon enough. 3 weeks before that Tuesday morning, Marcus had walked into the Halberd building for the first time as an employee rather than a visitor. Badge freshly printed, the plastic still faintly warm from the machine. The lobby smelled like fresh paint and ambition, the particular scent of a company that had recently redone its brand identity and wanted everyone to notice. He rode the elevator up to the 14th floor, with his laptop bag slung across one shoulder, and a lunch he'd packed himself in a scratched Tupperware container, because $11 for a cafeteria sandwich was $11 he'd rather put toward his daughter's shoes, which she was growing out of at an alarming rate for a 7-year-old. His daughter's name was Ellie, and she was the reason Marcus had taken this job in the first place. Despite the salary being lower than what he'd earned at his previous position, despite the commute adding 40 minutes to each end of his day, Halberd offered something his last employer hadn't, a health plan that actually covered specialist visits, and a schedule that let him be home by 6 most nights, which mattered more to him than any signing bonus could. He didn't explain any of this to his new coworkers. He didn't explain much of anything. In his first week, when Priya asked where he'd worked before, he said a firm downtown and left it there. And when she pressed, not unkindly, just curious the way new colleagues are curious, he redirected the conversation to the project timeline with the smooth, practiced ease of someone who had learned long ago that some doors are better left unopened until the right moment. The strategy division at Halberd was a small, tightly wound machine of 11 people, managed by a director named Renata Cole, no relation to Marcus, a coincidence that would later strike people as almost too convenient. Though it wasn't convenient at all. It was simply a coincidence, the kind reality produces more often than fiction would dare. Renata was 44, sharp-jawed, precise in her speech, and fiercely protective of the numbers that made her division look good on a quarterly report. She had built her career on being the person who delivered results, and she had learned to be less particular about how those results were produced than she once had been. Beneath her sat 2 senior associates who ran the daily rhythm of the office. Jordan Weiss, 31, whose charm worked like a well-oiled hinge on everyone above him and like sandpaper on everyone below. And Court Ferris, 26, who had joined only 4 months earlier and had quickly discovered that agreeing with Jordan was the fastest path to being liked. Priya Anand, 30, occupied a stranger position, competent, quietly ambitious, aware of the office's undercurrents, but generally choosing not to swim against them. It was Jordan who first noticed Marcus's shoes, not on the first day, Marcus had worn his one good pair that Monday, the black Oxfords he saved for interviews and funerals. Polished the night before at his kitchen table, while Ellie did her homework across from him, asking him questions about long division that he answered while running a cloth over leather that had long since lost its shine. But good shoes wear down fast when a man walks 2 miles each morning to save the cost of a second bus transfer, and by the second week, the scuff along the left toe had become impossible to hide, no matter how carefully Marcus angled his foot beneath his desk. "Rough weekend?" Jordan asked one Thursday, nodding toward Marcus's shoes as they waited for the elevator. His tone was pleasant, almost solicitous, the kind of comment that could pass as friendly concern to anyone listening from 3 feet away. "Something like that," Marcus said, and smiled, because he had found, over the years, that smiling cost him nothing and denied his critics the reaction they were fishing for. It became a pattern, small remarks, spaced out just enough that no single one of them could be called harassment. Each one calibrated with the instinct of a man who had spent his adult life learning exactly how far a comment could go before someone might report it. Jordan complimented Marcus's jacket in a tone that made clear he meant the opposite. He asked, in front of the whole team, whether Marcus had raided a vintage shop for his tie. He once suggested, loudly enough for half the floor to hear, that Halberd should institute a dress code for everyone's sake, and looked directly at Marcus when he said it. Marcus never answered in kind. He never explained that his rent had gone up 11% in the past year, while his daughter's asthma medication had gone up nearly twice that. He never mentioned that every dollar he didn't spend on himself was a dollar that went toward Ellie's swimming lessons, which her pediatrician had recommended for her lung capacity, or toward the small emergency fund he was rebuilding after his divorce had drained the one he and his ex-wife had spent a decade building together. He never explained any of it, because explaining it would have meant asking for sympathy, and sympathy was not what Marcus wanted from people like Jordan Weiss. What Marcus wanted, quietly and without ever saying so, was time. Time to watch. Time to understand exactly how this division actually worked, beneath the polished surface of its weekly reports, because Marcus Doyle had not been hired to be an analyst. He had been hired to be invisible. That was, in fact, precisely the arrangement, agreed upon in a conversation 6 weeks before he ever set foot in the Halberd lobby. Sitting across a table from the company's CEO and majority owner, a woman named Adeline Voss, who had built Halberd from a 4-person consultancy into a 210-person firm over the course of 15 years, and who had recently begun receiving numbers from the strategy division that did not add up the way they should. Adeline had not hired Marcus to fire anyone. She had hired him because 3 of her largest clients had quietly expressed concerns in the past year. One about a project timeline that had been billed at nearly double its actual hours. One about a proposal that seemed to have been copied almost verbatim from a rival firm's earlier pitch. And one, most troubling of all, about a junior employee who had resigned abruptly 6 months prior and later mentioned in an offhand exit interview conducted by an outside consultant that she'd been pressured to falsify a compliance report. Adeline needed someone who understood operations, who could read a spreadsheet the way most people read a sentence, and who could sit inside a department for weeks without anyone suspecting he had the authority to end their careers. She had found that person through an old colleague who vouched for Marcus's integrity. In terms so specific, the kind of man who returns a lost wallet with the cash still in it and doesn't tell anyone he did it, that Adeline had hired him after a single interview. Marcus had once run internal audits for a mid-sized manufacturing firm before it was acquired and gutted, laying off 400 people in a single afternoon, including him, on a Friday 2 weeks before Christmas, 3 years earlier. He knew what it felt like to be the person carrying the cardboard box. He had promised himself, riding the bus home that night with Ellie's Christmas list folded in his coat pocket, and no way yet to pay for any of it, that if he was ever given power over anyone else's livelihood, he would use it only when the evidence left him no other choice, and he would use it fairly, without cruelty, and without ever confusing accountability with revenge. So he watched. He filed reports. He kept careful, methodical notes on his personal laptop each evening after Ellie went to bed, cross-referencing timesheets against client invoices, comparing draft proposals against a growing folder of publicly available pitch decks from competing firms, quietly documenting each small cruelty directed at him. not because he needed it for himself, but because pattern was evidence, and evidence was the only thing that could survive a hearing. The deeper he looked, the clearer the picture became. Jordan Weiss had been padding his billable hours for over a year, small enough increments each time that no single invoice looked suspicious. But the pattern across 18 months added up to nearly $40,000 in fraudulent charges to 3 different clients. Court Ferris, still new enough to be more careless than corrupt, had been instructed by Jordan to backdate a compliance sign-off on a project that had in fact never received the required review, a shortcut that could have exposed Halberd to significant regulatory liability if it had ever surfaced during an audit that wasn't friendly. And the proposal that had seemed suspiciously familiar to one client turned out to be exactly that. Jordan had lifted large sections of a competitor's publicly filed case study, changed the client's name, and submitted it as original work, a plagiarism that would have been merely embarrassing if it hadn't also violated the confidentiality terms of Halberd's contract with that client. Renata Cole's role was murkier, and Marcus spent the most time there because he did not want to accuse a woman of complicity that might, in the end, turn out to be nothing more than negligence. A director too overworked and too eager for good numbers to look closely enough at how those numbers were produced. What he eventually found, buried in a folder of email threads Renata had never expected anyone outside her direct reports to see, was worse than negligence. She had known about the padded hours for at least 4 months. She had known, and she had said nothing, because Jordan's inflated numbers made her division's quarterly performance look exceptional. And exceptional performance was the currency Renata had built her entire career on. Marcus did not confront any of them. He did not raise his voice, not once. Not even the Thursday Jordan made the vintage shop comment in front of 6 colleagues, and Court laughed a half-second too eagerly. The laugh of a man trying to prove loyalty he didn't fully feel. Marcus simply nodded, gathered his notes, and went home to help Ellie with her homework, because whatever was happening in that office, it was not going to be allowed to touch the parts of his life that actually mattered. By the start of his 3rd week, Marcus had compiled a file that ran to nearly 60 pages, invoices cross-referenced against actual project logs, email timestamps that contradicted sworn timesheets, side-by-side comparisons of the plagiarized proposal, and a signed statement from the former junior employee who had left 6 months earlier, now willing to speak on record because someone had finally asked her the right questions in the right way. The Monday before that fateful Tuesday, Marcus requested a meeting with Adolin Voss. He did not send the request through Renata, as protocol technically required. He sent it directly, using the private channel Adolin had set up for exactly this purpose. And he attached his file without a single word of preamble beyond a simple subject line. Findings, Strategy Division. Adolin read the entire document twice. She called Marcus into her office on the top floor that same evening, after most of the building had emptied out, and the two of them sat across from each other in the fading light of a March sunset while she asked him question after question, testing every claim, probing for gaps, because she needed to be certain before she moved, certain in a way that would hold up not just to her own judgment, but to legal review, to HR review, to the eventual scrutiny of clients who deserved to know exactly what had happened to their money. "You could have brought this to me after the 1st week," Adolin said at one point, studying him with an expression that mixed respect and something almost like apology. "You didn't have to sit through all of it." "I needed to be sure," Marcus said. "A man who's already decided what he wants to find usually finds it." "I didn't want to be that man." Adolin nodded slowly, and something in her expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular recognition of meeting someone whose character matched the reputation that had preceded him. "Legal will want another day to confirm the documentation holds," she said, "but I don't think they're going to find anything you missed." They didn't. By Tuesday morning, when Marcus walked into that glass-walled conference room in his mended navy jacket and Jordan Weiss made his joke about Halloween costumes, the wheels were already in motion. Legal counsel had reviewed the file overnight and confirmed its findings were airtight. Adolin had spoken privately with the firm's 3 affected clients, all of whom expressed more relief than anger, relief that someone had finally caught what they'd only half suspected, relief that Halberd's leadership had chosen transparency over concealment. HR had prepared termination documentation for 2 employees and a formal written warning alongside a mandatory retraining program for a 3rd whose culpability was real, but considerably smaller than the others. What none of them knew, not Jordan, not Court, Not Renata, not even Priya, who had stayed quiet through most of it, and would later be relieved that her quietness had never crossed into complicity. Was that the man they'd spent 3 weeks mocking for his shoes had at 9 that morning sat in Edlin Voss's office and been asked, formally, whether he would accept the newly created position of Director of Internal Standards, reporting directly to the CEO with authority over compliance across every division in the firm. He had said yes. Quietly, the way he said most things. The meeting in the glass-walled conference room that Tuesday was not, in fact, a status update, though everyone in the room believed it was. Right up until the moment Adeline Voss walked in personally, something she almost never did for a mid-level department meeting, and asked Renata, Jordan, and Court to remain behind after the others were dismissed. Priya gathered her tablet, glanced once at Marcus with an expression he couldn't quite read, and left. Court's easy confidence had already begun to falter. The particular tightening around the eyes of someone recalculating too late every shortcut he had ever agreed to. Jordan, for his part, still smiled, still believed, right up until the final few minutes, that whatever this was, it would not touch him. Marcus did not stay for that conversation. It was not, by that point, his role to deliver the news himself. Adeline had insisted on doing that personally, out of respect for the gravity of what was about to happen to 3 careers, and Marcus had agreed, because there was no dignity in turning accountability into spectacle. He returned to the desk he had occupied for 3 weeks, a desk that, within the hour, an office assistant would already be preparing to relocate to the 15th floor, to an office with his name freshly printed on the door, and he answered a few emails, and he waited. It took 40 minutes. The first sign was the silence. Conversations that usually drifted across the open floor plan simply stopped. Then Court emerged first, face pale, carrying almost nothing. He had few personal items at his desk. Having worked there only for months, escorted by a member of HR toward the elevator with the practiced, gentle efficiency of people who did this more often than anyone would like to admit. He did not look at Marcus. He did not look at anyone. Jordan came next, and where Court had looked stunned, Jordan looked furious. The particular fury of a man who has just discovered that the rules he assumed didn't apply to him had, in fact, applied all along. He was carrying a cardboard box. Someone had handed him a detail so on the nose that later, retelling the story to friends, several employees would swear they'd never actually seen anyone use a cardboard box for this in real life until that day. And as he crossed the floor toward the elevator, his eyes landed on Marcus. "You," Jordan said, and there was real venom in the single word. Marcus looked up from his monitor, unhurried. "Me," he agreed, and said nothing else, because there was nothing else that needed saying. And because he had learned that the loudest satisfaction is usually the quietest kind. Jordan opened his mouth, as if to say more, glanced at the HR representative, standing a careful 3 feet behind him, and thought better of it. He turned and walked to the elevator, and the doors closed on him, and that was the last anyone at Halberd Consulting Group ever saw of Jordan Weiss. Renata's departure was different. No security escort, no cardboard box, because Renata had, in the end, chosen to resign before the termination paperwork could be finalized. A distinction that mattered enormously to her and meant almost nothing to anyone else. She stopped at Marcus's desk on her way out, the first and only time she had ever initiated a conversation with him that wasn't strictly procedural. "I want you to know," she said, her voice carefully controlled, "that I never asked Jordan to do what he did." "I know," Marcus said, and he meant it. The file was clear on that distinction. "You just decided not to look too closely at how he did it." Renata's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, the only visible sign that the conversation had not unfolded the way she'd hoped it might. She had come to Marcus's desk expecting, perhaps, some acknowledgement that would soften the shape of what was happening to her. What she received instead was simple, unembellished truth, delivered without malice and without mercy. And somehow that was worse than either would have been alone. "For what it's worth," Marcus added, as she turned to leave, "the recommendation letter I wrote for you was honest. It says you're talented. It also says why you can't work here anymore." Both things are true. She left without responding. By Wednesday morning, the story had traveled through every floor of the building in the particular way. Office stories always do, fast, distorted, half true, half invented, but unmistakably centered on one detail that nobody could quite stop repeating. The quiet new guy in the thrift store jacket had, it turned out, been the reason Adeline Voss herself walked into a routine meeting and ended 2 careers in 40 minutes. Priya found Marcus at the coffee station that morning, and for a long moment she simply stood there, working up to something. "I should have said something," she finally admitted. "About the comments, about Jordan." "You didn't have to," Marcus said. "You never joined in. That mattered more than you think. Did you know on day 1? Did you already know it would go this way?" Marcus considered the question honestly before answering, because he owed her that much. "I didn't know what I'd find," he said. "I only knew I needed to actually look before deciding anything. Most people decide first and look for reasons after. I try not to be most people." Over the following weeks, Marcus's new position gave him the authority to do something he had wanted to do since the day he arrived, though he had never once let it show. Rebuild the culture Jordan and Renata had quietly poisoned, one small policy at a time. He introduced a confidential reporting channel that guaranteed no retaliation, staffed by an outside firm so no internal manager could quietly bury a complaint again. He restructured the billing review process so that no single associate could inflate hours without a second, independent set of eyes, catching the discrepancy within a pay cycle rather than a fiscal year. He personally reviewed every active client relationship the strategy division managed, reaching out to each account with a level of transparency that several clients later described in follow-up surveys as the reason they chose to renew their contracts rather than walk away in the aftermath of the scandal. Court Ferris, notably, was not fired. Marcus had argued for this personally in his meeting with Adeline and legal counsel. Pointing to the evidence that Court had been pressured rather than initiated the wrongdoing, and the fact that Court, unlike Jordan, had cooperated fully and immediately once questioned, providing information that helped confirm the scope of what Jordan had done. Court kept his job, under a formal warning and a mandatory ethics course, and within 6 months had become, somewhat to his own surprise, one of the most careful and conscientious associates in the entire division, the kind of quiet redemption that never made it into office gossip, because quiet redemption rarely does. It was nearly 4 months later, on an unremarkable Thursday afternoon, that Marcus finally cleared out the desk on the 14th floor for good. Having moved his daily work permanently up to the director's office on 15th As, he packed the last of his things into a small box, not because he was leaving, but simply because the desk was being reassigned to a new hire. Starting Monday, his hand closed around the same scratched Tupperware container he'd carried in on his very first day, the one that had held that morning's leftover pasta, and which Ellie had decorated years earlier with a strip of masking tape and a crayon drawing of a lopsided sun that had somehow survived 100 trips through the dishwasher. He looked at it for a long moment. It occurred to him, standing there in an office that had once mocked the fraying cuffs of his jacket, that the container was still exactly as worn and unglamorous as it had been on day 1, and that he had never once felt the need to replace it. Because the things that actually mattered, a promise kept to a daughter, a debt of honesty paid to strangers who trusted him with the truth, a quiet insistence on doing the difficult, careful work rather than the easy, cruel kind, had never had anything to do with the state of a jacket cuff at all. He carried the box to the elevator himself. No one offered to help him, and he didn't need anyone to. On the ground floor, he walked out past the front desk, where a new receptionist, hired after the restructuring, greeted him by name without needing to check a directory. Because by then, everyone in the building knew exactly who Marcus Doyle was. He walked the 2 miles home that evening, the way he still did most days, not because he had to anymore, but because he'd found somewhere in the last several months that he liked the quiet of it. The chance to let the day settle before he walked through his own front door, and Ellie ran to meet him, asking, as she always did, what had happened at work today. Nothing much, he told her that evening, setting his old Tupperware container in the sink to wash. Just a normal day. It wasn't, not really. But some things Marcus had learned were worth keeping quiet, not out of secrecy, but out of the simple, steady conviction that the truest measure of a man's character isn't what he says about the justice he's done, but what he chooses to carry home with him at the end of the day, and how gently he sets it down. If this story touched something in you, hit that like button. It helps this channel grow. Subscribe if you haven't, because we share stories like this every day. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next one.